Who wrote Genesis, 1,500 years before Moses? The creation story you grew up with has an older original. Clay, divine blood, a labor strike by gods. 4,000-year-old tablets describe it, word for word. Stay, and you'll read what Genesis deliberately left out. The gods dropped their tools and refused to work. That is what the clay says. They burned their digging baskets. They marched on Enlil's house in the deep of the night. Enlil called for his brother, Enki. The two gods sat together in the darkness and made a decision. They would make something new, something that had never existed. They would make a worker who would never strike. This is not myth borrowed from somewhere else. This story was pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago, 1,000 years before the first word of Genesis was written. The workers who revolted were gods. The being created to replace them, shaped from clay, animated by the blood of a slaughtered god, was the first human. That is what the Sumerians recorded. The clay and the divine blood and the breath of life. These are in your Genesis too. The same sequence, the same materials, the same garden waiting afterward. The flood is there. The paradise is there. Even the man formed from the dust of the ground. Your translation of that phrase traces back to a Sumerian scribal school that no longer exists. The tablets were unearthed. They were translated. The parallels were mapped, cataloged, confirmed by every credentialed Assyriologist who studied them. And yet, the more precisely scholars translated the Sumerian, the stranger the problem became. The tablets do not say what the ancient astronaut theorists claim, but they do not say what anyone expected either. What the clay actually contains, beneath the mistranslations, beneath the sensationalism, is already stranger than the myths built around it. Understanding what the Sumerians were actually doing, what they meant by gods, by clay, by blood, will permanently change how anyone reads the creation story they thought they already knew. The original story of how humanity was made, older than any religion still practiced, has been waiting in the clay for 4,000 years. This is the Anunnaki. The story of how the human race was made is older than the Bible, by 1,500 years. It was written in clay, pressed by hand into wet mud in the river valleys between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it names the God who built us, the God who saved us, and the reason neither of them ever fully trusted what they had made. What those tablets say, and what later traditions quietly erased, is the subject of what follows. Enki, Lord of the Abzu, God of wisdom, God of the deep fresh water beneath the earth, sits at the center of this story. In the tablets, he does not sit still. He argues with his brother. He defies a divine oath. He speaks warnings to a wall of reeds so that the man behind the wall will hear and survive. He creates humanity and then spends the rest of the mythology trying to protect it from the God who ordered him to make it. The tablets come from ancient Sumer, the southernmost reach of Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq. Thousands of fragments, fired clay impressed with cuneiform script, many sitting in museum basements for over a century, only partially read. The oldest among them predate the Hebrew book of Genesis by at least 1,500 years, some by more. They were waiting in the ground long before anyone thought to look. In the beginning, according to the Sumerians, there were gods. They called them the Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens to earth. And in those early days, the gods themselves labored. They dug the riverbeds. They carried the soil. They cut the irrigation channels by hand. For 40 cycles of years, perhaps 40 generations, they worked without rest, until the more powerful ones refused, and the lesser ones, the ones doing the actual digging, burned their tools. The gods went on strike. That is what the tablets say. The Anunnaki laid down their tools, they burned their digging baskets, they gathered before the house of Enlil, the chief of the gods, and they demanded relief. The text of the Atrahasis epic records their revolt without softening. The younger gods, the Igigi, marched in the night. They surrounded the house of their lord. The sound of their discontent, the tablets say, woke the heavens. Enlil summoned his brother Enki. The two gods consulted in the darkness. Enlil wanted order restored. Enki, the clever one, the one who understood the deep machinery of creation, offered a solution that no one had imagined before. Create a substitute, he said, a being that will carry the labor, a being made of clay and breath and the blood of a god. This is the oldest recorded answer to why humans exist, not to seek truth, not to love or to worship freely, but to work. The Sumerian word for this first creature is Lulu, the primitive worker, made to carry what the gods had put down. Every tradition that came after would soften this answer, dress it in purpose, surround it with dignity. The Sumerians did not. They wrote down what they believed, without apology, and the answer was labor. The question that haunts every scholar who has read these tablets: how much of this did the writers of Genesis already know? To understand the answer, one must travel back further still, to the moment the tablets were first unearthed. In 1849, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard descended into the ruins of Nineveh. He found a library, not a room of books, but a buried archive of clay tablets, over 30,000 of them belonging to the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. They had been sealed under rubble for 2,000 years. George Smith was not a trained scholar. He was an engraver by trade, a young man who had taught himself cuneiform by studying tablets during his lunch breaks at the British Museum. In 1872, working through the Nineveh fragments alone at his desk, he read a line that stopped him. It described a great flood, a single righteous man, a boat, animals taken two by two. He stood up. He began pacing. He reportedly tore off his shirt. The colleagues who witnessed it said they had never seen a man so undone by words on clay. What Smith had found was the Gilgamesh flood narrative, a Babylonian account of the flood that predates Genesis by centuries. The discovery landed like a stone into still water. If the flood had a source older than the Bible, what else did? The question moved through the scholarly world of Victorian England quietly at first, then with force. It has not stopped moving since. The Atrahasis tablet, the most complete Sumerian account of human creation, was assembled from fragments spread across 3 different collections. The British Museum held one portion, the Louvre held another. A third sat in a private collection in Iraq. Scholars pieced them together across 50 years of correspondence, as if assembling a broken mirror from shards scattered across continents. The mirror, when finally assembled, showed something deeply familiar and deeply uncomfortable. The creation scene in the Atrahasis reads as follows: Enki and the birth goddess Ninmah prepare a clay pit. Into it, they mix clay from the earth below. They mix it with the flesh and blood of a slain god, a god named Wi-Ilu, chosen specifically for his intelligence. Ninmah shapes the clay into a body. Enki speaks the words of life, and the first human opens its eyes. The Hebrew text of Genesis uses a word for the substance of creation, Adamah, red clay, red earth. The first man is Adam, the one made from Adamah. In Sumerian, the clay of creation is mixed in the Abzu, the deep fresh water beneath the earth, the house of Enki. One tradition reaches back for its first word and finds clay. So does the other. The same material, the same depth. written by people who had never, so far as we know, met. Samuel Noah Kramer, the 20th century's most celebrated translator of Sumerian, spent 40 years reading these tablets. He was not given to sensationalism, but even Kramer wrote, with barely restrained astonishment, that the parallels between Sumerian mythology and Genesis were not influence at the edges. They were influence at the foundation. Consider the sequence in Genesis chapter 2. God forms man from the dust of the ground. He breathes life into his nostrils. He plants a garden. He places the man there to tend it and keep it. He creates animals. He creates woman from the man's rib. Then, in chapter 3, the knowledge of good and evil is forbidden, and the penalty for obtaining it is mortality. In Sumer, this entire sequence already existed, already written, already ancient. The Sumerian text called Enki and Ninmah describes the creation of multiple human prototypes, beings shaped from clay who are imperfect, diseased, incomplete. One has weak hands, one cannot see, one cannot control its bladder. Enki, compassionate, finds a place in society for each of them. It reads less like theology and more like a laboratory log, a record of failed attempts before the final form. Failed experiments. The gods tried, and tried again. This is not the Genesis version, but it may be what Genesis was built on top of. The Sumerian paradise, the land called Dilmun, appears in the tablet known as Enki and Ninhursag. Dilmun is described as pure, as clean, as a place where no lion kills, no wolf takes the lamb, no illness moves through the air. It is a garden at the beginning of time. Enki plants 8 trees there. He is warned not to eat their fruit. He eats anyway. He falls gravely ill. A goddess is created to heal each wounded part of his body, one for his rib. The Sumerian word for rib is Ti. The goddess created to heal Enki's rib is called Ninti, Lady of the Rib. But Ti also means life. So Ninti carries 2 meanings at once, Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life. In Hebrew, that double meaning was lost in translation, and so Eve became only the mother of life, her connection to the rib reduced to anatomy. The elegant knot the Sumerians had tied came undone. Only one thread survived. Thorkild Jacobsen, the Danish-American Sumerologist who spent his career at Harvard and Chicago, described reading these tablets as hearing a very old conversation through a wall. The words are recognizable, the voices are familiar, but the room they are spoken in is not any room the modern world has entered before. The Anunnaki themselves, whose names scholars translate most commonly as those of royal blood or those who came from the heavens to earth, appear in texts spanning 2,000 years of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian writing. They are not a footnote. They are a council of gods, ranked and hierarchical, governing the fates of cities, rivers, and every human life the scribes thought worth recording. The sky, the ground, the water, the dead. Each had an Anunnaki to answer for it. But then, in the 20th century, one man read the tablets differently, and the world has never fully recovered from what he claimed. Zechariah Sitchin was born in Baku in 1920 and raised partly in Tel Aviv, where he studied the Hebrew Bible and, unusually for a non-academic, taught himself ancient Sumerian and Akkadian. He was not a university professor. He worked in business. But he spent decades reading the same tablets as Kramer and Jacobsen, and arrived at conclusions that the academic world rejected as spectacular and unfounded. Sitchin's 1976 book, the 12th planet, proposed, based on his own readings of the tablets, readings mainstream Assyriology does not accept, that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a planet he called Nibiru. They came to Earth to mine gold, he argued. When their labor force mutinied, they used genetic engineering to create Homo sapiens, combining their own biology with that of early hominids. In Sitchin's framework, the clay was a metaphor. The blood of the god was a literal, genetic event. The tablets, he believed, were science in myth's clothing. Credentialed scholars examined his translations and found them, consistently, unsupported by the cuneiform record. The 12th planet sold millions of copies across dozens of languages and generated a genre of ancient astronaut literature that persists to this day. The cultural footprint is real and large, but the scholarly response was equally clear. Sitchin's translations contained errors, selective readings, and constructions the original text does not support. His Nibiru does not appear in the tablets in the form he described. His genetic narrative has no Sumerian equivalent. The story he told was his own, built from the tablets' architecture, but not their words. Consider one example. Sitchin claimed the Sumerians used a specific term for rocket ship in descriptions of how the Anunnaki traveled. The compound term he cited, describing a gleaming object that traverses the sky, appears in funerary texts referring to the flight of the soul after death. It is elegiac language, poetic, not aerospace. The difference is not minor, and it repeats throughout his entire body of work. And yet, Sitchin was wrong about the translations. He was not wrong that the tablets say something extraordinary. Because what the tablets actually say, when read by credentialed scholars using established Assyriology, is already astonishing enough. The gods argued, they grew exhausted, they created a being to carry their work. That being was made of clay and divine blood. It was placed in a garden. It was given a partner. It was denied certain knowledge. It multiplied beyond control. The gods sent a flood to reduce it. One man was warned in secret and survived. Genesis chapter 6 contains a passage that has troubled theologians for millennia. The Nephilim, beings translated variously as giants, fallen ones, or sons of God, appeared on earth when divine beings took human women as wives. The children born from this union were mighty, ancient, renowned. The passage is given 4 verses and then abandoned. No explanation, no resolution, as if the author included it because it was in the source, but did not know what to do with it. In the Sumerian texts, this mixing of divine and human lineages is not a mysterious aside. It is a recurring foundation. Kings draw their authority from divine parentage. Heroes like Gilgamesh are described as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a fraction that resists clean arithmetic, and was perhaps meant to. The boundary between human and divine in Mesopotamian thought was a line drawn in water. The Anunnaki were the ones who drew it, and the ones who crossed it. Enlil, Enki's older brother and the highest authority among the Anunnaki, regarded humanity with growing alarm. The humans he had initially approved of were multiplying faster than calculated. They were noisy. The tablets use a specific word, rigmu, a great tumult, a clamor that disturbed the gods' rest. Enlil could not sleep, and when gods cannot sleep, the tablets suggest they reach for catastrophe. 3 times Enlil attempted to reduce the human population before the flood. First with plague, then with drought and famine so severe the texts describe parents eating their own children. Each time, Enki secretly warned a chosen human, in the Atrahasis, a man named Atrahasis himself, how to survive. Enki was not supposed to interfere. He did anyway. The tension between the two brothers is the engine that drives the entire mythology. When Enlil finally ordered the Great Flood, the deluge that would erase humanity entirely, the Council of the Anunnaki swore an oath of secrecy. Not one god was to warn the humans. Enki found a way around the oath. He did not tell Atrahasis directly. He spoke to the wall of a reed hut. He said, "Wall, hear this. A flood is coming. Build a boat. Take aboard all living things." The man behind the wall listened. The man behind the wall survived. The parallel with Noah is not approximate. It is structural. In both accounts, a divine decision to destroy. A single chosen survivor warned in advance, a boat with specific dimensions, animals taken aboard, a flood of overwhelming scale, a landing on a mountain, the release of birds to test for dry land, a sacrifice after survival, divine regret, a promise that it will not happen again. The skeleton of Genesis chapters 6 through 9 is Sumerian. The question was never whether the Hebrews knew these stories. Of course they did. The question is what they chose to keep and what they quietly erased. The Hebrew people spent decades in Babylon. The Babylonian exile began in 597 BCE and lasted, for many, until the Persian conquest of 539 BCE. During those years, Hebrew scholars lived in the same city that had preserved the cuneiform tradition for 1,000 years. They heard the Babylonian flood in the temples, the creation story in the markets, the garden myth in the schools of the scribes. The old stories entered them the way water enters stone, slowly, without announcement, through every available crack. What they transformed most significantly was the number of gods. In Sumer, creation was a council decision, debated, contested, nearly derailed by disagreement. In Genesis, there is one God. The drama of the divine argument is compressed into a single consciousness. The plurality is hidden, except in one place. Genesis 1:26. Let us make man in our image. The plural remains, unexplained, unresolved, a ghost of the older story, still speaking inside the newer one. The city of Eridu, the oldest city in Mesopotamian tradition, believed by the Sumerians to be the first city ever built, sits at the southern edge of ancient Sumer. In the texts, it is described as the city that descended from heaven, the place where the first temple was raised, where kingship first came down to earth, where Enki himself had his house, the Abzu, rising from the fresh water beneath the ground. Excavations at modern-day Abu Shahrain have confirmed a settlement dating to 6,000 years before the Common Era. It may be the oldest urban site on Earth. Among the texts found in Eridu and surrounding sites is a document scholars call the Sumerian King List. It records the names of kings who ruled before and after the flood. Before the flood, the list says, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years each. After the flood, the list notes the transition with a single phrase. The kingship was lowered again from heaven, and the durations of reigns become recognizably human. Decades, not millennia. As if the flood was not just a story, but a boundary, a reset. Geologists and archaeologists have found evidence of a catastrophic flood event in the archaeological layers of multiple Mesopotamian cities. Ur, Kish, Shuruppak, dated to approximately 2900 BCE. The flood layer is real. It is not universal. It does not cover the whole Earth, but it was large enough to obliterate entire cities and plausibly erase every human being a Sumerian scribe had ever heard of. For the people who survived, it must have felt like the end of everything. Memory and myth are not opposites. They are the same impulse, reaching in different directions. What the tablets reveal, in the end, is not proof of ancient astronauts. It is not a debunking of Genesis. It is something more unsettling than either of those things. It is the sight of human beings, 4,000 years ago, asking the same questions that every generation has asked since. Why do we suffer? Why do we work without rest? Why do we die while the gods, or whatever stands above us, do not? The Sumerians asked these questions first, and they answered them without consolation. The gods made us to carry their burden. That was the truth they could bear. Enki, at the end of the Atrahasis epic, looks at what he has made. The humans have survived the flood. They are multiplying again. Enlil is angry. The council debates what to do. And Enki, the one who created humanity, who saved humanity, who argued for humanity at every turn, now agrees to new limitations. Mortality, miscarriage, the celibacy of certain women, mechanisms to keep the human population in check. The creator, in the end, becomes the one who limits what he created. In Genesis, after the expulsion from the garden, God says something that stops the careful reader cold. The man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. The fear is that he will also take from the tree of life and eat and live forever. The humans must be expelled before they achieve immortality. The structure is identical to the Sumerian story. The gods are afraid of what their creation has become, and they act, not from wrath alone, but from fear. Fear. That is what the oldest story in the world is about, not human sin. The gods' fear of what humans might become. The tablets of Sumer are still being translated. New fragments surface from museum storerooms every decade. In 2015, a tablet fragment from the flood narrative was identified in a private collection and authenticated. It contained a detail about the ark that no previous cuneiform version had included. The animals, it specified, were to be loaded 2 by 2. That single detail, previously known only from Genesis, turned out to be Sumerian after all. The story keeps revealing how deep its roots go. Scholars estimate that less than 10% of the cuneiform tablets that once existed have been found. The rest are still underground, beneath the sands of southern Iraq, beneath cities inhabited for 6,000 years without pause, beneath sites too dangerous to excavate, too remote to fund, too politically contested to reach. The rest of the story is still there, in the clay, waiting with the patience that only buried things possess. And the one question the tablets never answer, the one the Sumerians left open despite everything they recorded, is the same question every tradition since has circled without landing. Not where did we come from, but whether the ones who made us ever looked at what they had done and felt, beneath all the arguments and the flood and the fear, something that resembled love.